Welcome to Quilter's Architect. My name is Mark. In today's video, I'm introducing the quilt pattern Royal Tulips. And I'm going to approach this from a stash buster perspective, but someone could also use their scraps to make the dark fabric in the flying geese and the petals of the flowers if they chose to do so. So what is the history behind this quilt pattern, or why did I come up with this? Well, on my wife's channel, Lessons Learned, a viewer had come into possession of some vintage blocks, and then they made some additional blocks and to be able to complete a quilt. And so we thought some viewers might be interested in just seeing a pattern with this block design. So looking at the block design here on the screen, you can see that the middle part of the block consists of a king's crown design, and then surrounding that on the four corners of that are 4 tulips. This is kind of a nice vintage looking block, and we thought this would be very interesting. Maybe perhaps some of you would also like to make a quilt with this block design, and so this pattern will make it very easy to see how to piece this block and make a very beautiful quilt. And so I went ahead and put together this pattern, Royal Tulips, and this pattern has 4 blocks across and 5 blocks down the length of the quilt. So a total of 20 blocks. Of course, you could adjust the pattern. If you'd like to make a smaller project, you could reduce the size of those blocks. But of course, you would have to adapt the cutting instructions a little bit because you'd be using less fabric. And also your sashing and borders would need to be adjusted accordingly. So you notice looking at this pattern, I have it up here on the iPad as well, that this design, the way it looks in the pattern, is kind of like a floating effect where the border and the sashing and the background are all the same fabric. And that's actually what I plan to do. I have this fabric here, and this is called Fossil Fern, and it's by Benartex. And I'll get a little better picture, but I'll show you that here. And so this seemed like it would make a real nice background to go with the other fabric that I have. So that's my stash yardage for the background. To go along with that, I have this layer cake, and I wrote this down since I'll be turning this towards you. This is called Floral Party by Wilmington Prints, and you can see some of the fabrics in here, some of the different florals and different colors. Seems like it'd go very well with a flower oriented or themed quilt. This layer cake also has this fabric within some of these squares, these pre-cut squares. But we also have 1 yard of this fabric in addition to the layer cake. And so what I plan to do with this is, if you notice the block design, each block has a frame around it. And what I plan to do is I want the frames to be consistent. I feel like the quilt will look better if all those frames around each block is the same fabric. And so I'm going to take this yard along with a few of those that are found within the layer cake itself. And that's going to be enough fabric for my frames. The other thing I plan to do is, you'll notice that in the center of this block, where that king's crown portion of the block is at, it has 4 flying geese. I'm going to find the darkest fabrics in here in this layer cake, and I'm going to use those darker fabrics to create the dark portion of the flying geese. Of course, the lighter fabric in the flying geese will be this background fabric, which I plan to use throughout the quilt for the background. And then I have all of these tulip petals in each of these blocks. And so what I plan to do for these tulip petals is not the darkest fabrics in here, but the medium, potentially more the mediums, maybe even some a little on the lighter side. I plan to use all of those for the petals of the tulips. And then I do have inside of this layer cake this fabric here. So what I was thinking is, each of these tulips in the Royal Tulip block has that little center part of the flower that's like a lighter color, right? And so I was thinking this bright color would be nice for all of those, and I'm pretty sure I have plenty of that to take care of that. So again, maybe you have some yardage in your stash that you could put together to make this quilt. I'm taking from my background fabric from stash, this layer cake. Maybe you have a layer cake on hand and some nice fabric that would work for a background. And then to augment your layer cake, you might need a little bit of additional fabric if you want to make those frames all be the same fabric. You might say, well, I don't want to go with my stash, I want to go scrappy. And you probably could do that with the dark fabric in the 4 flying geese on each block, as well as the petals of the tulips. I'm not sure if you would want to do this, but another option would be to make all of the background within each of the blocks inside the frame also come from scrappy. That would be another option, but you would have some variation in the look of your quilt. As you looked across those 20 blocks, it may not look like they're floating as much, but you would see the distinct individual 20 blocks because you'd have different background fabric within the frame. You could also make the border a different fabric as well as the sashing. But I felt like this overall floating effect would look really nice with these Royal Tulip blocks. Well, so how much fabric would you need if you were pulling from your stash or yardage? For the navy, which is the dark fabric and the flying geese, you're going to need half a yard. And for that dressed-in fabric in the pattern, this is the tulip petals. You're going to need 7/8 of a yard. And then there's another fabric here, which is the frame around each of the blocks, and we're calling that in the pattern tan dot. You'd need 1.5 yards of that. The background fabric, which I'm using this fabric, I'm calling that tan swirl. You need 4.5 yards if you use the same background fabric for the entire quilt. Then lastly, we're calling the center of the flower where there's like the kind of yellowish color, or you could go with orange or another color that's brighter. We're going to need 1/8 yard of that to complete those flowers. So I hope you'll take a look at your stash and your scraps and join me in making this Royal Tulips beautiful quilt. So on page 2, we can take a quick look at the cutting instructions. And this might be helpful as you're thinking about, especially someone who's thinking of maybe scraps or from their stash, what fabric do they have available? What are the size of the pieces that we're going to need? And so we're going to need in this navy, the dark part of the flying geese, we're going to need 25.5-inch squares. And then for those tulip petals, we're going to need 80 2.5-inch squares and 83-inch squares. And then for the tan dot, which is the frame around each of our blocks, we need 40 1.5 by 14.5-inch strips and 40 1.5 by 12.5-inch strips. Now the tan swirl is the one that I've decided to go with the entire background of my quilt to give that floating effect. And notice all the different piece sizes you're going to need from this. Some of these are inside the block of the tulip block itself, and others are actually as far as like the background of the quilt or the sashing. So we need 83.1/8-inch squares, 24.5-inch squares, 84.5 by 2.5-inch rectangles, 83-inch squares, 81.5 by 2.5-inch rectangles, and 81.5-inch squares. Then we need 15 2.5 by 14.5-inch strips, 4 2.5 by 62.5-inch strips, 2 3.5 by 78.5-inch strips, and 2 3.5 by 68.5-inch strips. So you can see there's a lot of different sizes within that, but if you were thinking about scrappy for the background of those blocks, if that's an option you wanted to choose and you weren't getting that floating effect or going for that floating effect, then possibly some of these sizes might align to some of your scraps. And then lastly, for the center of the flower, we have this small little square, 1.5-inch square. We need 80 of those. At the bottom of page 2, I also have some brief notes here. I'm assuming a 1/4-inch seam allowance throughout the quilt. You can press the seams as desired. And then for width of fabric, if you use this cutting instructions and you're pulling from yardage, if you notice under the cutting instructions where I have all the piece sizes to cut, I also have out to the right-hand side a column, strips to cut, if usable width of fabric is 42 inches or over. So this is something you might consider, that if you're trying to figure out if your fabric will work with the way the pattern lays out the pieces and the requirements, that width of fabric is one important detail. Well, we do have some work to do to cut all our pieces out for this quilt, and that's the first thing I'm going to focus on. I do need to do, obviously, a little pressing with this background fabric as it's, folded up. And so that's the first thing I'm going to get started on, is cutting out the pieces for my quilt. For the background fabric, I went ahead and cut out all the strips first. Here are my 83 1/8-inch squares, 20 of the 4.5-inch squares, and then we have 80 of these 4.5 by 2.5-inch rectangles, 80 of the 3-inch squares, 80 of the 1.5 by 2.5-inch rectangles, 80 1.5-inch squares, And here I've taken all the 2.5-inch strips and joined them together and pressed those seams. So I have this ready so I can cut out my sashing pieces. And I've done the same with the 3.5-inch strips to have the border strips all joined together so I can then cut out the border strips. And for the fabric called maize in the pattern, I have all the 1.5-inch strips cut here. And from those strips, I cut 80 1.5-inch squares. And here are the 1.5-inch strips I cut for the fabric called tan dot. This is for the frames around each block. Now from those strips, I cut these 1.5 by 14.5-inch strips and 1.5 by 12.5-inch strips. And then for the fabric called navy in the pattern, I cut out these 5.5-inch squares. And again, these are the large squares that'll be used when making the flying geese. From this point forward in the video, I'm going to demonstrate making one of these blocks, and I will show all of the steps. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is make these flying geese. In the pattern, I included this appendix page for making flying geese. You may have your own method or approach you find that works the best for you. This is the way I'm doing it, making 4 of them at a time from the fabric piece sizes included in the pattern. And then back on page 3 in the pattern, notice we'll be using fabric pieces A and F to make the flying geese. And then after that, when we're making the flying geese unit, we'll also be using fabric piece H. So the first thing we're going to do is make the flying geese themselves. So in my case, I'm going to do what the instructions say by drawing a line diagonally on the wrong side of the smaller squares. This helps me to guide the fabric through the sewing machine in a straight line. Some of you may be more expert level and may not need to draw those lines, but I find it helps me. And for each set of 4 flying geese we're making, we'll be using 1 of the 5.5-inch squares and 4 of the 3.1/8-inch squares. It seems to me like it's easier if the fabric, the smaller piece of fabric that's in the front that first goes in the sewing machine, is overlapping or on top of the other small piece of fabric. And so I'll just join the fabric together, sewing directly along that line, which puts the seam 1/4 inch to the left of that line. And then of course turn that around and sew on the other side of the line. And now just cut this directly on the drawn line, corner to corner. And this will give us the first 2 units that we're working with for the flying geese. And now of course we'll need to press these. And I'll press these smaller squares that have been cut into flaps to the outside. And next we'll take these 2 units and join a small square to each of them. And we'll just take our smaller square and place them on these 2 units like this, right sides together, and then we'll join these. We'll do the same thing as before. With the smaller piece, we'll join the 2 pieces using that line as our guide to on the right side of the foot, and then we'll just turn those around and go down the other side of the line. And now we'll just cut directly on the line on these 2 units, and we'll end up with our 4 flying geese. And then of course, just as before, we'll press these smaller units to the outside corner. The fabric piece sizes I gave in the pattern to make the flying geese are intentionally larger, and the reason is this allows us to cut a little bit of fabric off all four sides. So we'll use our ruler to line up on the point, and then we'll work our way around all four sides, cutting to end up with a perfect flying geese. So here we have all four of our flying geese completed. It's time to move on to making the flying geese units. So as a quick look back at our instructions, here it mentions how we're using fabric piece H with the flying geese to make the flying geese unit. So we'll move on to doing that. So I laid all the pieces out here with the flying geese. One important detail, orient the point correctly on the flying geese when joining these together, or otherwise you'll be getting out your seam ripper to rip the seam and orient them correctly. And so we'll join these together to form our flying geese units. I'm still learning from my mentor Sherry, who saw this activity and said I really should have put the flying geese facing me so I could see the point as I was sewing the seam on those. So better to do it that way. And of course we'll press our seams. You can do these either way you want. I'm pressing them open, but another option would be just to press them to one side. And here are the 4 flying geese units completed. Time to move on to the next step. Next in our pattern on page 3, it talks about making our half square triangles. We're going to be using fabric pieces C and I to make the HSTs. Most of you probably won't need this, but in the pattern I have an appendix for more details about making HSTs if you want to refer to that. And of course the reason we're making these HSTs is our tulip petal units include HSTs, and so we'll do this kind of as a preliminary step. Again, this is an optional step, but I'm going to draw the line from corner to corner on the wrong side of the lighter squares. I find it helps me to line up in the sewing machine better. And again, we'll line up the right side of our foot, our pressure foot, with that line, and we'll sew a 1/4 inch seam on each side of that. So we'll go down one side, and then we can just take our chain pieces, turn them around, and go back through on the other side. And of course we'll need to cut these, cutting on the line corner to corner. Then we'll want to press each of our HSTs, and we'll press these to one side. Just as in the case of the flying geese, the fabric pieces for the HSTs are sized big enough to trim off a little bit of fabric from all 4 sides to end up with perfect HSTs. So here we have all 8 of our HSTs completed for this block. Now it's time to move on to making our beautiful tulip petal units. So here on page 3 in the pattern instructions, to make our petal corner units, you can see that the first thing we need to do is take fabric pieces K and P and make these double square units, and then we'll be taking fabric pieces J and those double square units to make the petal subunit. Here I have all the fabric pieces used for this laid out together. So first we'll join these 2 pieces together to make our double square units. These are a little tedious, these little 1.5 inch squares. You could do these as strip sets instead of individual squares. I chose not to do that, but you may find that would be something you would prefer to do. So once we have these together, we'll need to press them, of course. And Blue, Blue, our dog, is wanting to be in someone's lap. So he got up there, I was trying to iron, and he insisted on being in my lap. And he always needs a little bit of attention now and then. Here are 4 double square units. Time to join these to these rectangles. I'm just pressing these to one side. And here are the 4 petal corner subunits completed. Here on page 4 you can see that our instructions are continued, and this illustrates how we would join our subunits together to create a top and bottom unit, and then join those together to create our corner petal unit. So here I've laid all of those subunits out together, and you can really start to see how these flowers are going to be really pretty. So time to join these into top and bottom units, and then we can join those top and bottom units to create each of the corner petal units. So first I'll join pieces to form the top and bottom units. And after pressing all of those, I'm going to rearrange them with the top and bottom units together as they should be oriented, and I'll join these together. Joining my top and bottom units. And of course we'll press these and pressing to one side. And so that completes our 4 petal corner units. Time to move on to the next step. Here on page 5 in our pattern, you can see the instructions for making the Royal Tulip block. Now we're taking all of these units and subunits we've made, along with that center square fabric piece G, and we're assembling these into top, middle, and bottom unit. And then we'll join those 3 top, middle, and bottom units to form the center unit of the block. Here I have all these subunits and pieces laid out together, and now it's time to join these together. And here's the center unit of the block all joined together. I think this is really going to look nice. Well, I wanted to share a lesson I learned. It took me almost to the end of making this quilt to realize it. But when joining the units of this block together, the top, middle, and bottom units, those flying geese have to line up or that king's crown does not look right on the front. I wasn't very happy with how some of them turned out. I was pinning them, but what I was not doing until I got to the very end was when I was joining the pieces together, those 2 units together, I was not paying attention to where the seam came across that little angle in the fabric. You can see on the back, I have an arrow pointing to both of these. That seam needs to go right where that 45-degree angle comes together. And if you don't hit that, then when this is pressed, the seam is pressed open, and you unfold this and look at it on the front, those flying geese points don't line up and the king's crown doesn't look quite right. So that's something I learned. It took me making almost all the blocks in this quilt to finally come to the realization. I kept pinning and thinking, what in the world is going on? Why don't these line up the way I'd like to see them line up? Well, that was it. So there are different ways to pin these, but that paying attention to where that seam hits on that 45-degree angle, that fabric, the color distinction there, that is a key detail. You might be looking at this example I gave and ask, well, this doesn't look like any of the fabric you used, and it's not. It's because for each pattern, I always do a test block to validate the pattern, and this is my test block. On page 6 from our pattern, you'll notice the instructions for continuing to make the Royal Tulip block. Here we're using fabric pieces E and D to join to the center unit. These strips around the outside of the block are really framing the block to give it a really nice look. So here I have the side strips laid together with the center unit of the block, so I'll join these together. And here's the center unit with the side strips joined to it. Now I just need to join the top and bottom strips. And here's the completed block. I like the way this is all framed up, and I'm looking forward to seeing how all the different fabrics within this layer cake turn out in the Royal Tulip block as I continue. For these first 2 blocks, I used a multi-floral set of fabrics. For each fabric selection from my layer cake for the petals of the flowers as well as the flying geese, I'm making 2 blocks from those same set of fabrics. And so here are the 2 blocks from the first fabric selection that I was working on demonstrating the block construction. And now I'm going to show you in quick succession each of the other fabric selections and the 2 blocks I made from each of those. This is my purple fabric selection and the 2 finished blocks from that fabric. This is my pink fabric selection and the 2 finished blocks from that fabric. Here's my teal fabric selection and the 2 finished blocks from that fabric. Here's another multi-floral fabric selection and the 2 finished blocks from that fabric. Here's my emerald fabric selection and the 2 finished blocks from that fabric. Here is an aqua floral fabric selection and the 2 finished blocks from that fabric. And yet another multi-floral fabric selection and the 2 finished blocks from that fabric. Here is my turquoise fabric selection and the 2 finished blocks from that fabric. And here's the last fabric selection, aquamarine, and the 2 finished blocks from that fabric. Now that I have all these blocks made, I'm going to arrange them and then I'll label them after I get them all arranged as to how I'm going to put the quilt together. After taking a picture of this and looking at it, I think a couple changes are needed here. On page 7 in the quilt pattern, it illustrates how to join the blocks and vertical sashing units, and I'll do this for each of the rows. And here I have laid out on the floor the first row of blocks along with the vertical sashing units. Time to join these together. Here's that first row all joined together. And here's the second row, the third row, the fourth row, and the fifth and final row. On page 7, our instructions continue to make the row and sashing unit. So here we're using our horizontal sashing strip, and we'll only do this for rows 1 through 4. And here you can see I have the first row unit along with the horizontal sashing laid out on the floor to join together. For longer sashing strips like this, I usually find it helpful to pin them. That way the fabric's evenly distributed across the row. And so pin it at each end, and then in the center, and then another pin in between the center and each end. On page 8 from our pattern on the left side, you see illustrated how to join rows 1 and 2 to form the top half of the inner quilt. And here I have laid out on the floor the first 2 row and sashing units ready to join together. And here's the top half of the inner quilt joined together. Here on page 8 again in the pattern, the right side illustrates how to join the 3rd and 4th row and sashing units to the 5th row unit to form the bottom half of the inner quilt. So here I laid those out on the floor so you can see them ready to join together. And here's the bottom half of the inner quilt all joined together. Page 9 from the pattern on the left hand side illustrates joining the top and bottom halves of the inner quilt. I'll do that now. And here they are ready to go, laid out on the floor. And of course, similar to before, I'm pinning these at each end in the middle, and then again between the middle and the ends. And here's the inner quilt all joined together. I really like how this is turning out. Again on page 9 in the quilt pattern, on the right hand side, it illustrates how to join the side borders to the inner quilt. So I'll do that next. Well, it's getting too big to take pictures laying flat on the floor. So I laid it across the long arm so I could show you the side borders joined to the inner quilt. Page 10 of the pattern illustrates joining the top and bottom borders to the inner quilt. So that's the next step. Once a quilt gets big enough, it's hard to get a square picture from above standing on the floor. So I did turn it sideways and move something in the room and got a little better picture with all the borders joined to the inner quilt. So Sherry was kind enough to work me in on the long arm, and she chose this modern, it looks like modern flowers from the name there on the screen as the quilting pattern. And here you can see where she's configuring the long arm, what this pattern is going to look like. This should be really nice with these tulips. And here we can see a little bit of the work of the long arm. This quilting pattern really looks nice on these Royal Tulip blocks. For the binding, I'm going to continue with the idea of the floating effect for this quilt, and so I chose the background fabric that I've already been using to cut out my strips for my binding. And here I have my binding strips all joined together as well as pressed, ready to go. Time to get busy joining this binding to the quilt. Well, it's a nice sunny day, so I took the quilt out and hung it up on the pole barn, and here you can get a really good look at the quilting in this really good sunlight. Well, I hope you enjoyed joining me for this Royal Tulips quilting project. I'm hoping that some of you will also make this quilt and send Sherry pictures of your finish on Finish It Friday. Please leave any comments you'd like and give a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Until next time, I'm wishing you happy sewing and beautiful finishes.